If you're watching us on YouTube, you'll notice that we have more men than usual in our audience. That's because we invited them here. Let's talk about the term toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
Now, you say that this elicits all sorts of reactions, and you call that phrase the emperor of all oxymorons.
Hold the line. Hold the freaking line. Welcome to Manosphere Highlights Daily, where we call out feminist foolishness, expose women's hypocrisy, dismantle double standards, and stand up for men. Whenever mainstream media suddenly decides to care about men, you already know something's off. And today, Oprah is back, doing what Oprah has always done, packaging the same old narrative under a shiny new headline of concern. But before we even start, notice this. Comments turned off, the one place where real men could speak, the one space for pushback, the one area of accountability. Disabled. Why? Because this isn't a conversation, it's a broadcast, a sermon. They brought on Scott Galloway because the statistics about male loneliness, dropout rates, and social collapse are now too big to hide.
You believe that a lot of mothers are also the ones who are sounding the alarms on what's going on with young men.
But here's the trick. They didn't bring him to fix the system. They brought him to protect it, because Scott delivers the only message mainstream media allows. Men are failing, so men must do better.
What can men do leaving here? Be better.
Not the system is broken. Schools failed boys. Dating economics are rigged. Masculinity was attacked for decades. Just men try harder. Men be better. So today, we're doing the job the comment section cannot. Let's break it down. Now it's time for us to get into this and do what we gotta do. Because we men, ain't we? We men, ain't we?
Because we're talking about the alarming statistics that show that many men, especially young men, are not okay. And actually, in what some people believe is a dire crisis.
Exactly, Oprah. Men were never your audience. Men were never your priority. And suddenly now, during a historic male mental health collapse, you care? The foolishness.
I want to just hear from some of you here. So what's on your mind? What's your reaction to all of the headlines? You all have been seeing the headlines yourselves. And how is that impacting or reflecting on your lives?
Of course, this is happening across all mainstream platforms. Because when a crisis gets this big, you don't solve it. You control the narrative first. And that's where Max enters.
So, Max, what do you want to say?
First off, thank you both so much. I think this is such an important conversation. I'm 23, I'm a senior at NYU, and I think I'm speaking for all of my friends when I say that we feel lonely. Young men, anger is really the only societally acceptable emotion that we can express. We're confused, and we kind of need a voice in this wilderness, and you are that, and that's why this conversation is so important.
And right here, this is where you see the setup. Oprah opens with Max for a reason. Young, soft-spoken, emotional, non-threatening, the perfect representative of what mainstream media wants men to sound like. Because if you start the conversation with a man who's direct, critical, calling out the system, it breaks the narrative. So instead, they lead with a voice that positions men as lost, confused, and in need of guidance. Specifically, guidance that fits Oprah's worldview. This isn't an accident. This is how you pre-frame an audience. Not by letting men with real grievances speak, but by selecting the safest version of male struggle.
We feel lonely. Young men, anger is really the only societally acceptable emotion that we can express. We're confused.
We're lonely. We're confused. Please help us. It disarms the issue and steers the conversation right back into the politically correct lane Scott Galloway is about to drive down.
So,
wow.
Thank you.
Can I just ask you this,
Yeah.
Max? Do your friends say that to each other, or how is that expressed?
This is something that we text each other late at night. This is not something we talk about out in the open. These are conversations that we have, over the safety of a digital wall. And this is something that is really hard for us to talk to each other about face to face, out in the open.
And what are you all actually saying? Because the use of the word lonely, I mean, I've never heard, young men say, I am lonely. So
The foolishness. And of course, Oprah says, I've never heard a man say he's lonely. Of course you haven't, because you don't care, because men aren't allowed to be lonely in your world, only useful. Pew Research shows men and women feel loneliness at similar rates. But when it comes to reaching out for support, men are stranded. Why? Because vulnerability is labeled feminine, soft, weak. And now, after decades of shaming men for emotional needs, the same system says, why don't you open up more? They created the wound, then act confused about the bleeding. And they have to, because the men who want real conversation are coming to the manosphere to be heard.
are people texting each other saying, I'm lonely, or are they saying what?
I mean, you've mentioned that it took you forever to cry. I remember the last time one of my male friends texted me, I just cried for the first time in years. And it's out of desperation. Yes, I'm lonely. I don't know what I'm doing with my life. It's desperation.
Male self-deletion has been peaking for the last 7 years. Mainstream media didn't treat it as an emergency, but the manosphere did. And of course, if you point to the real causes, you're labeled an angry man, an incel, or someone who can't get laid. Now the crisis is too big to ignore, and suddenly the manosphere becomes the narrative competitor Oprah has to counter. Damage control mode activated.
As you see it.
Well, the statistics are pretty stark. If you walk into a morgue and there's 5 people who've died by suicide, 4 are men. 3 times as like we have a homeless problem and an opiate problem, but what we really have is a male homeless and a male opiate problem. 3 times as likely to be addicted, 3 times as likely to be homeless, 12 times as likely to be incarcerated. More single women own homes than single men. Women in urban areas are making more money. And let me be clear, we should do nothing to get in the way of that.
This is why Scott Galloway and Richard Reeves are safe guests, because they will say nothing to hold women and feminism accountable, because this is exactly what feminism did. They wanted women to join the labor force even at the detriment of men. So now that the problems feminism has caused can no longer be denied, we need a politically correct advocate to address it without touching the feminist narrative. And here's why Scott Galloway is allowed on that couch. Because he will never connect male decline to feminist policy, education bias, untouchable female privilege, dating economics, legal asymmetry. He carefully lists the damage, then surgically removes the cause. That's what makes him safe.
There's a cartoon Oprah of the poor woman in her 30s that didn't find romantic love, and she's in a big sweater looking out on a rainy day, listening to sad music. What a tragedy. That's a cartoon. The reality is, men need relationships much more than women. Widows are happier after their husband dies. Widowers, it's true, widowers are less happy. Women live longer in relationships. They live 2 to 4 years longer. Men live 4 to 7 years longer. So men actually need relationships more.
No! Men do not need relationships more than women do. But society keeps feeding men that message because it ensures men stay oriented toward romance, validation, and emotional labor instead of purpose, sovereignty, and legal fairness. If a man's value is tied to whether a woman chooses him, then failing at romance becomes failing at manhood. Convenient for a system that runs on male labor, male productivity, and male sacrifice. Not so convenient for men who need something deeper, purpose, stability, and fair laws. Why do you think women report being happier after divorce? Because legally, the system is tilted to their benefit. This is where they can legally destroy men, something this entire discussion conveniently avoids. Nothing is said about the unfair laws.
A boy, when he loses a male role model, at that moment is more likely to be incarcerated than graduate from college. What it ends up is that while boys are physically stronger, they're emotionally and mentally much weaker. And what we need, quite frankly, is we need more men to step up and fill the void. There are 3 times as many women applying to be big sisters in New York as there are men applying to be big brothers. So we have an obligation to get involved in a young man's life, right? And it's just to summarize here, If we want better men, we have to be better men.
And here it is again, the default chorus. Men need to step up, but there's no mention of why men stepped back. Men didn't decide overnight to stop mentoring boys. What happened? What happened to fathers being in the home? What happened to male coaches being trusted? What happened to male teachers not being treated like a walk-in liability? What happened to spaces where boys could be boys without being pathologized? This didn't come out of thin air. It came from a cultural shift that redefined men not as leaders or protectors, but as potential threats.
Tell us about what happened to him and why you think it's relevant here.
Larry Summers was the president of Harvard University, which made him one of the 10 most powerful people in America. He was extremely well connected. He was an extremely illustrious and well-respected economist, very academically capable as a scholar on his own terms. He was also very politically connected. He had served in the Clinton administration in the 90s. Really just a towering pillar of the establishment. He was invited in that capacity to speak to a conference on women's representation in science. And he said at the beginning of his remarks, when the organizer invited me to come here, I said, I've got 2 versions of this speech. I can give you the nice one, where I tell you all the great things that Harvard is doing to improve female representation in science departments, or I can give you a genuine, sincere, off-the-cuff rumination on why I think women remain underrepresented in science. I can give you the real talk. I can, the fuzzy bureaucratic one or the real one. And he said he wanted the real one, so here it is. And he proceeded to give what was actually fairly mainstream assessment of male and female differences when it comes to the hard sciences. He said that men are more likely to be represented out at the tail end of the ability bell curve. So you have more men than women who are way in the top 0.1% of scientific ability. And that also women tend to be less interested in these systematizing scientific topics than men. So even women who are extremely intellectually capable tend, as a matter of taste, to be more interested in more humanities and personal focused fields. Well, one of the most important aspects of this story is that he thought he was off the record. He was off the record. And the rules of off the record say that you can't take quotes from somebody's off the record speech and hand them to a journalist. But one of the classic differences between men and women is that men are more likely to be invested in rules, whereas women are more likely to focus on the outcome that they want, that they think is going to be best, and kind of fudge the rules to get their way to the outcome that they want. And that's, whether or not you accept that's true of men and women in general, certainly in this case, the women ignored the off-the-record rule, took Larry Summers' quotes to a feminist journalist, and stirred this up into a massive national scandal. And the thing that was so dismaying for those of us who remember watching it unfold at the time is that these women who were trying to get Larry Summers fired, and as they eventually did not offer any arguments. They did not try and say that what Larry Summers said was wrong on the facts. What they said in the quotes that they gave to the New York Times was, "I was so offended I couldn't even breathe. I had to leave or I would have passed out." And I'm sitting there thinking, you're not really beating the allegations that you're emotional rather than rational, ladies. Feminist hysteria managed to unseat one of the most powerful people in the United States from one of the most valuable positions simply on the basis of being offended without even trying to argue that what he had said was wrong.
So by that,
The foolishness. Helen Andrews brings up the Larry Summers moment, not to relitigate the politics, but to show a turning point, a moment when emotional offense became more powerful than evidence, a moment when institutions learned one wrong sentence can end your career. Agree or disagree with her interpretation, the outcome is real. Men watched institutions become places where risk outweighs participation. So when Scott says men need to volunteer more, he's ignoring the obvious. Teachers, coaches, mentors, leaders. Those roles didn't disappear because men ran from responsibility. They disappeared because the environment stopped being safe for men. You can't shame men out of a public life for 2 decades, then turn around and scold them for not showing up. This is not about avoiding responsibility. This is about institutions that treat male presence as a hazard. That's the context Scott won't touch.
Let's talk about the term toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
Now, You say that this elicits all sorts of reactions, and you call that phrase the emperor of all oxymorons. What's your take?
Well, I don't think there's any such thing as toxic masculinity. I think there's cruelty, there's abuse of power, there's violence. But masculinity is supposed to get in the way of those things. Women need to cross the street when they see men because they feel safer, right? It breaks my heart that you hear in New York, women are afraid to get on subways, and they'll say because there's too many men.
Yep.
So from a very young age, we have to teach our boys, you're a protector. That's how you demonstrate masculinity. And it's not just physical. Real men break up fights at bars. They don't start them. Your default operating system as a man should be to weigh in and protect. That's why we're here. We have denser bone structure, better double twitch muscle, and this amazing thing called testosterone. And the whole reason we're given that is such that we can protect people. Move to that.
And here's where the contradiction finally exposes itself. Scott says masculinity must protect women. Men must intervene. Men must make the world safe. But let me ask a real question. Since when was the world ever free of crime? Since when was it ever safe for anyone, man or woman, to move without risk? And here's the part nobody wants to touch. When men tried to practice prevention, don't walk alone at night. Be careful where you go. Cover yourself in dangerous areas. They were called controlling, toxic, oppressive. Women said, we will not be controlled. But when something happens, suddenly, where were the men?
Where were you? He was that close to me.
You cannot reject male authority, mock male guidance, criminalize male boundaries, and then demand male protection on command. That's not how protection works. Protection requires respect, rules, boundaries, authority, and those are the exact things modern culture stripped from men. They told men to open up, but only in ways that don't challenge the system. They told men to step up, but never asked why the ground keeps collapsing beneath their feet. They told men to earn more, while pretending the price of entry never changed. This wasn't about helping men. It was about reprogramming them to keep absorbing the cost of a broken deal. So here's the real message for the men watching. Don't let televised concern fool you into carrying a burden that was engineered, not earned. See the game, understand the setup, and most importantly, hold the line.
Management, we working. Protect yourself at all times. This video has officially been highlighted.